Welcome to Spooky Ass Shit. I am your host, Eric Dwinells, and with me tonight, this is a gentleman that I met, kinda, on the streets of Salem.
I didn't really announce myself, to be fair.
Yeah. Well, that's why I guess I more met your wife.
Briefly, yes. There is photo evidence of that, yes.
Yeah, convicted witch. But this gentleman's name is Charles Duston, and he has a podcast called Iconography. And it's about all kinds of... Is it always American?
No, the first season was all British, actually.
Oh.
I was living in London at the time, yeah.
Oh, okay. So iconography from around the world. And if you want to check out the Iconography podcast, and I highly recommend that you do so, you can visit iconographypodcast.com, or you can follow Charles on Twitter at iconographypod. I would describe it as mostly a history podcast with kind of an NPR vibe, very professionally edited. Charles always does a great job, so I do recommend you check it out. You kind of focus on different places in each season.
Yeah, that's the idea. I moved, which is one reason why I did. Oh, well, that's the end of season 1 and the start of season 2 is I moved from England to New England. But that was always sort of the plan, was to focus on different areas and then kind of let the sprawl be, well, what are the different sort of things that mean things to people that really help them kind of form the identity of the place they live in. And then take on all these meanings. So in Britain, it really started with something like London Bridge, which is like a really sad, not cool bridge, but as an idea is so evocative and kind of going into, so why is that? And other stuff like Guy Fawkes that kind of, I think, mystifies us as Americans, but kind of really means so much to them. And now that I'm living in New England, I'm a Floridian. So, I mean, the same applies. You know, it's stuff that makes me curious that I've always sort of known about but never dug into before. And, you know, one of those things, which is where I kind of came across you, was Salem, was the witch trials.
Right. And so for newer listeners of mine who maybe haven't heard me talk about it, hard to believe because I talk about it all the time. But if you don't know, I am the one and only Witchfinder General of Salem, Massachusetts. That's a street character that I perform. And Charles and his wife happened upon me one October morning in Salem. And he took my card, which I have little cards to advertise the podcast. And he reached out to me to ask if I would be a guest on his podcast. And Charles, I am honored that and grateful that I have finally been recognized as an icon. And thus you had me on your show.
You were basically the star of that entire episode. Like, people told me afterwards, like, it's all about Eric, that episode. And it really was. Like, when I found you, I was like, this guy out here kind of towing the line, being the Witchfinder character, having all the history behind it, kind of making a mockery of it, but really honoring it. Like, I was like, this is what my show is about. Like, I've never found someone who so encapsulates in one character what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
So I was like, I gotta get him on.
I appreciate that. And if you are a listener of mine and you haven't listened to iconography in general, but specifically that episode, which remind me again what that specific episode was titled. I know it's from season 2.
Yeah, it's the second episode on Salem, and it's called The Crucible of Modern Salem.
That's the one. And let me tell you guys something. We talked for a long time. I forget exactly how long it was, but I feel like it was more than an hour.
It was like 90 minutes, yeah.
Yeah. And he edited it down, and I was really worried about how I was going to come off on it, because you know me, I'm a stumbling, rambling fool. And Charles did a wonderful job editing it. See what I'm saying? Stumbling. And making me sound like I knew what I was talking about, and like I was giving clever, coherent answers. So it's a very good episode. And I even like the part where he says, and then Eric trails off as I'm talking. That was one of my favorite moments. A lot of my friends like that too. They're like, you do trail off a lot when we talk. Yeah, okay.
But I do want to mention, like, so the thing we're going to be talking about today on your show, though, I'd never heard about it before, and you brought it up. I don't think I left it in the episode, but you did mention visiting the Hannah Dunston house and the bobblehead, and you were like, I asked you, is there a line? Because the whole Salem tourist industry is sort of like always courting that line of like, have we gone too far? And your answer was sort of like, I don't really think there is a line. And then your caveat was kind of like, but there is that bobblehead with the Hannah Dunstan house. And I was like, that was the first I've ever heard of that. And, I always knew kind of I'd be coming on your show at some point, and I want to hear more about it because I still don't know much about it. I looked at the Wikipedia article, and I'm like, one of the things that I love is people who were super, super important and famous after they were dead, but also a long time ago, and aren't really known anymore. And that seems to totally be her bag.
Yeah. Well, so just in brief, before we really get into it, what Charles is referencing, of course, is the subject of tonight's show, Hannah Duston, who I always want to call Dunstan, by the way. So
Hannah Duston.
if you catch me calling her Dunstan, I apologize, but her name is Dustin, and I don't know why, but I want to say Dustin. But,
apparently, I do too.
Yeah. She is a woman from the 1600s who was captured by Native Americans during a skirmish with the English settlers, and she escaped in a very spectacular way, which is going to be the meat of tonight's episode. But of course, as Charles brings up, it raises a lot of questions. First of all, what is the correct way and correct reasons to kind of make someone an icon, which is what made me think of it when I thought of you and your show, because of course your last season was all about the Puritans and the English settlers and everything, the first English settlers of Massachusetts. And her story is, I mean, when we tell it, I think people will be a little bit, I don't even know what the reaction will be, but I know that when I found out about her, which wasn't, all that long ago, and I've lived in Massachusetts my whole life, I would assume if you grow up in Haverhill, where she's from, and very much celebrated, you probably have an inkling of who she was. But I grew up, about an hour away from there, and I've never heard of her. Right. And I think I first learned about her looking for weird places to visit on like I forget the name of the website. I should totally give them a plug, but I can't think of the name of it. But it's like some kind of roadside oddities website that you can check out. And it listed this bizarre statue in the middle of Haverhill of this woman holding a hatchet and like mean mugging and pointing. And I was like, what the fuck is this? And then I read the history about it, and I was like, they made a statue about this? Like, I was a little bit shocked. And we'll get into my visit to the gift shop and all that stuff later on. But let's get into the meat of today's episode now. To properly frame it, I want to go into a little bit of the history behind it. So first of all, I want to talk, this story takes place in the late 1600s, and I want to talk a little bit about what life was like in 17th century Massachusetts for these Puritan women. Most of the people living in Massachusetts were Puritans, although not all of them. And if you were a Puritan woman and you had a household, chances are you were running the household. And not only did you have to do all the chores that would be expected of a wife and usually mother, but you also had to know your husband's business, because oftentimes they would be called away to either attend to, town business or take part in skirmishes with natives or wars. So it was a very difficult life for these women. And that becomes important to a point which I will raise later on. Charles, I know that on your podcast, you have spoken to members of Native American tribes about some of the incidents that I'm about to speak about. So if you have any additional information, feel free to chime in and throw it at us.
Right, of course, yeah.
But I want to talk about the build-up to King Philip's War. So when the Pilgrims arrived, they eventually got to meet Massasoit, who was the leader, and if you know the correct pronunciation, and I'm saying any names wrong, by the way, let me know. But Massasoit...
I think it's the sachem, yeah.
Was the sachem? Okay.
Yeah.
I have Pockanacket.
Sachem is just means
Oh, sachem
chief, like,
means like the chief, like he's the
yeah,
okay,
the
yes.
leader. Yes.
Sorry. Okay, so he was the sachem of the Pokanoket tribe of the Wampanoag Nation. So Wampanoag, I think, is probably what most of us grew up hearing about. They don't really go into like, oh, they were Pokanoket or whatever branch they were. Our teachers probably just said, oh, they met some Wampanoags, and and technically that is correct, but Wampanoag is would be like the name of the country as opposed to the city where they lived, I guess, if we're trying to make a comparison.
It was made up of many different groups, of which at one time or another Massasoit would kind of band them together or not, depending on how dire things were. And even today there are, I think, two different Wampanoag, sort of nationally recognized Wampanoag tribes, at Mashpee and Aquinnah. Because obviously still around today, as you mentioned. I went and spoke with one of the people who was putting together the kind of the exhibit that they're touring around now in affiliation with the 400th anniversary of these events. So still very active. So yeah.
So Massasoit met with the Pilgrims, and it took a little time, but eventually relations between the English and the Wampanoag all throughout the state were peaceful enough through Massasoit's life, which lasted about 40 years after the arrival of the Mayflower. However, not all of the tribespeople and not all of the Wampanoag tribes supported Massasoit's efforts to keep the peace between the settlers of Plymouth, or perhaps we should say invaders, because there were some dirty deals done between the two factions here. Massasoit's eldest son, Wamsutta, sold land to settlers outside of Plymouth Colony, which, according to the members of Plymouth Colony, violated the contract that Massasoit had made with them. For this reason, the settlers imprisoned Wamsutta for 3 days, essentially. Or they at least put him on trial. I saw it. I don't know for a fact. I didn't dig, like I said, I didn't dig too deep into this. But I saw it read that he was put on trial and it lasted 3 days. And I also saw that he was jailed for 3 days. So I'm not sure exactly which one of those is true. But in any event, he spent some time with the English for 3 days. Wamsutta was then released, but he died shortly thereafter. His younger brother, Metacomet, then took over as the chief of the Wampanoag Nation. And he was pissed.
That's true.
Some historians believe that he blamed the death of his brother on the English settlers. And he said basically that while he was either at court or imprisoned by the English, that they poisoned him. And this is why he got sick and died so suddenly soon after this land deal was set in motion. And so some historians believe that this is one of the critical events that led to the first war between the natives and the English. Metacomet also had an English name, Philip, and the first war is known today as King Philip's War, and it lasted from 1675 till 1678. Again, the point of this isn't really to talk about the whole history of King Philip's War and all that, but I did want to mention it more than just in passing, because I feel like a lot of times these wars are mentioned as something that happened to the white settlers, and that's kind of all that's brought up about it. Of course, there's a lot more to it, and going into too much detail would be beyond the scope of this podcast in general and this episode in particular, but I did want to present some historical background. So it's not just like, oh, Indians used to attack the white settlers.
Right, and I do want to add some crucial nuance to this, which is it kind of frequently gets cited, this fascinating fact, which is true, that the Pilgrims came, the Pilgrims being sort of a nonsense term anyway, because of course they were all sorts of different people, some separatists, not Puritans, but separatists, some just guys who wanted to go to the New World and make money. But they did strike a treaty soon after meeting Massasoit that lasted about 50 years, which is remarkable, but it should be noted that, that wasn't with all Native Americans in the region. They totally killed ones who weren't friends with Massasoit, and also that that Plymouth was not the full extent of Massachusetts, and that the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was founded in 1630, which Boston was the seat of, there was a rather brutal affair with the Pequots in the 1630s. There was the Pequot massacre. That is probably a topic for its own episode of this podcast, because it is horrifying. And so there are all sorts of affairs of really rough stuff between the settlers and the natives. But, there's this one through line you can follow of 1620 all the way through to this brutal, absolutely terrifyingly, proportionally, historically horrific war that then breaks out, which is King Philip's War, where you have this through line of peace that is finally broken by essentially the children and grandchildren of Massasoit and William Bradford and the like.
Right. So during this war, there were native attacks on English settlements, and they would often take prisoners, including women and children. These captives might be held for ransom or sold into slavery in Canada, or they would kind of be assimilated into the native tribe. Now, I mentioned earlier how hard life was for a pioneer woman. And not just, when I say pioneer, I think we tend to think of the West, where they had to do a lot of work and it was really hard. But let's not forget, these weren't just pioneers in that sense. Especially when we're talking about Puritans, they lived in a very black and white world in every sense. And I don't know. Look, believe what you want religiously, right? But Puritanism does not sound like a good time, no matter how you cut it. It's preordained that you're most likely going to hell unless you're one of the elect. That's a whole another thing. And there's nothing that you can do to earn God's favor, really. And you just have to hope that if you live your best life, he'll at least be nice to you while you're alive. And there's no celebrating anything. There's no music. There's no games. There's, nothing. So there are documented cases of women being kidnapped by Native Americans who weren't really kidnapped. They actually would choose to go and live with the Native Americans. I just find that very interesting. This was not the case for Mary Rowlandson, who was abducted during King Philip's War. On February 10th, 1675, the settlement of Lancaster was attacked by natives, and Mary Rowlandson was one of 24 settlers taken prisoner. And Charles, I know you know a bit about this one. Do you want to kind of give us the story here?
Right. So this is, I read the account of Mary Rowlandson's captivity, which is obviously much more famous today than Hannah Duston's. I read it, it was on a course syllabus in college. Granted, the college course, I believe, was about captivity narratives, so it was right in the wheelhouse.
On the nose, yeah.
Yeah, and I've been reading up on King Philip's War as part of the whole thing that I'm doing currently in iconography. But so Mary Rowlandson is, I think, in probably her late 30s at this point, has multiple children. They get separated. Her husband is not abducted. We should get into this later. I don't know why in both of these cases, husband's just away and doesn't get abducted, which I think is kind of what you're alluding to. But all of her children are abducted. They're all separated except for her youngest daughter, who is with her. I believe her name is Sarah. And a few days later, Sarah succumbs to her injuries or to just the world, and obviously Mary is sad. The main thing that I kind of understand of this is the captivity narrative of Mary Rowlandson, as obviously skewed as it may be towards the white settler perspective, actually kind of gives us one of those rare first-person glimpses into what life was like on the other side, because she does spend quite a while over there before she's ransomed. So we get kind of detailed descriptions of Metacomet, who's going by King Philip, or they're kind of calling him King Philip, and other prominent players like Wetamu. And they're portrayed unsympathetically, but also not unsympathetically in a way. She kind of gives him a regality and a gentlemanliness, I think. I haven't read it in a long time, but it's an interesting interesting contrast, especially to what we're going to be talking about later.
Yeah, some of the quotes that they mention, she calls them, the Native Americans, she calls them barbarous creatures, murderous wretches, heathens, ravenous beasts, hellhounds. And she says that she feared them and was reviled by them and their ways. But she also is quick to point out that they never, quote, not one of them ever offered the least abuse of unchastity to me in words or action. So basically she was saying, like, yeah, they were savages, but they never molested me or raped me or tried any of that stuff with me. I don't even know if it's worth really bringing up, but I do wonder about that. I take her word for it, but on the other hand, too, knowing Puritans, if she probably wouldn't admit to it.
Exactly. And I mean, there's a lot of discussion about how much authorship she has over her own narrative in this case. I believe, in the case of Mary Rowlandson, like the captivity narrative of Mary Rowlandson is at least ostensibly is authored by Mary Rowlandson, but there's a lot of consideration that, I believe in this case, which one's the older one? Is it Increase or Cotton? Increase Mather is very involved in its authorship, which is interesting because, Cotton Mather then is essentially the mouthpiece for Hannah Duston later on. Like they have their hands in everything, the Mathers, of course.
You can't read anything about 1600s New England without running into one of the Mathers. And even to this day, I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but I don't know if it was last year or the year before, but the final person that I found guilty of witchcraft that year on the street was the 8th or 10th great granddaughter of Cotton Mather. And her family was like, do you know who this is? And I was like, oh. And I was like, he wasn't a very nice guy. And she was like, I know. So I was like, all right, at least you understand that, he's not really someone to celebrate, but yeah. But yes, I'm glad you brought up the Mathers because they do say that at the very least, it's likely that Increase Mather wrote the foreword to the original publication of Mary Rowlandson's account. And he might have even had some editorial comments thrown in too. But they seem to say that this is a lot. They think this a lot because there are many biblical references.
Right.
But Puritans of the time, in theory, would have been able to cite scripture and would have. Although
because if they hadn't been able to, exactly, yeah, that was a test in the witch trials.
I was going to say, on the other hand, though, we also learned from the witch trials, not all of them were great at that either. But That is the popular conception about Puritans, and that is the Puritan ideal, is that, yes, you would very well know your Bible. As I mentioned earlier, the Puritans have the idea of divine providence, which means God's already made up his mind and has already set in motion everything that's going to happen, and you can't change it, really. So to a Puritan, if they were abducted by Native Americans, then this was happening for a reason. Everything happens for a reason, and it's all part of God's plan, basically, right? So the best then that she can do is kind of take that into her mind and think, okay, this is happening to me because this is a trial from God, and he wants to make sure that I'm a good Puritan woman. And this is what she credits in the book as helping her get through her ordeal. Because she says, I know that this is just a trial from God, and I'm going to do my best to rise to it. I'm going to survive. I'm going to learn what I need to from these natives to help survive this situation, and in the end, I'll come out a stronger Puritan woman for it.
And they essentially did. I mean, this book was huge in its day and has sort of continued to be, but they function not so much as Jeremiads, but almost as testimonials. Like, not dissimilar to what we might think, like what a Scientologist would put out today, of sort of like, this is working. You know, I was put through the ringer. Here I am. You know, and so that obviously resonated with people on both sides of the ocean. You know, at that time. And that's the thing is, to us today, like King Philip's War seems like such a minor war compared to what would come 100 years later. But at that time, this was the first true, like, multi, you know, not quite multinational, but, you know, really sprawling, deadly affair. And it mattered so much to them, you know, and people who wrote accounts of it really became kind of celebrities of their day.
Yeah, so Mary Rowlandson definitely did, and like you said, this was a lot of people kind of consider this the first American bestseller. I mean, technically it would be a British bestseller, but it happened in America.
Right.
So yeah, that's probably why her case is, and the fact that she wrote it herself. Hannah Dunston does have a book written about her, but she never wrote anything herself. We're going to get into that in a little bit. But, and again, a Mather's going to pop up. But so let's get into her story. Again, a little bit of background. 10 years after the King Philip's War, King William's War broke out in New England and French Canada. This was not a war between settlers and natives. This was part of a larger conflict between England and France. Still, there were native alliances on both sides. The Abenaki tribe of Quebec took sides with the French, and they would raid New England settlements on behalf of the French. During King William's War, Hannah Duston, her husband Thomas, and their 8 children, 8 or 9, we'll get back to that, were residents of Haverhill, Massachusetts. On March 15th, 1697, when Hannah was either 39 or 40 years old, the town was raided by a group of about 30 Abenaki. Their farm was attacked, and somehow Thomas Duston managed to escape with most of the children. But Hannah and her infant daughter Martha did not get out in time. The infant daughter, by the way, depending on which source you're reading, was either 1 day old or 6 days old. But either way, very much a newborn. Hannah, the baby, and the family's nurse, a woman named Mary Neff, joined 10 other Haverhill colonists who were taken captive by the Abenaki. The Dunston house was then burnt to the ground, and Hannah was forced to carry her infant daughter into the wilderness as prisoners. Along the way, according to Hannah, one of her captors killed infant Martha by smashing the baby's head against a tree. There is some town legend, although it's not verified by any sources of the time, that it was a certain tree in an apple orchard, and this has become a famous place in town now, in Haverhill, still there. But there's some debate as to whether that incident took place exactly as stated anyway, but we'll get to all that. Hannah and Mary were turned over to a native family consisting of approximately 12 people, and they already had in their care a 14-year-old boy captive who was from Worcester named Samuel Leonardson. The native family were tasked with taking the captives north to New Hampshire. The Abenaki explained to the captives that once they reached the settlement in New Hampshire, they would be stripped, whipped, and forced to run the gauntlet. Are you familiar with that term, Charles?
Only colloquially and not in the sense we're probably using it here.
Yeah, so when we say run the gauntlet now, that just means like, oh, they gave me a lot of shit to do, basically, like, right? Like, oh, it was a real, like, pain in the ass.
Yeah.
And in a way, it kind of was a literal pain in the ass, because running the gauntlet was usually a military punishment. And what it was the soldiers would line up on 2 sides, and the person running the gauntlet would be put between the 2 lines and forced to run down between the 2 lines. And as they ran, the soldiers standing on either side would abuse them physically. So that was what was in store. They would be stripped, whipped, and forced to run the gauntlet when they finally got to the settlement that the Indians had set up.
Now, is this this is not involving French soldiers at all? This is something that they had sort of adopted over years of contact with the French and British?
It's a good question, but I don't know the answer because they don't actually make it that far. So I'm not sure if they were talking about when they reach an Indian settlement or if they meant like, a settlement.
She probably doesn't even know.
Right. Because Hannah was not down for any of that. So she, Mary, and Samuel began to plot their own escape. On April 29th or 30th, depending on what time it was, and we're not sure exactly what time it was, the group had stopped to make camp on an island located in the Merrimack River near what is now known as Boscawen, New Hampshire. The young men of the family who had been tasked with traveling with the captives had gone away for a few days to gather supplies. That meant that only 2 older men, 2 women, and several children were left to guard the captives. Hannah saw this as her best opportunity to escape. It had been almost a month and a half since their abduction, and by now the captives had learned the habits of the family holding them prisoner. Hannah and her fellow prisoners waited for their captives to fall asleep. Once all of them had, Hannah grabbed that good old preferred weapon of infamous New England women, the hatchet. She and Samuel crept up on their sleeping captors and struck their heads with the hatchets, thereby killing them without any struggle. Samuel killed one of the old men. Hannah killed the other, as well as 2 adult women and 6 children. They had intended to let one young boy live and take him as their own captive, but he awoke during the attack and ran into the wilderness. An adult woman survived her attack and was also able to escape. Now, according to a contemporary account, which was written just days after, spoiler alert, Hannah makes it out alive. So according to an account that was written just after Hannah returned to Haverhill, this was found in a gentleman's journal from that time, and he knew Hannah and heard the story directly from her. He notes that the boy mentioned that the Indian that he killed, the older male that he killed, the previous day or days before that, had showed him how Indians would scalp people. Just note that. With their captives dealt with, Hannah, Samuel, and Mary went to the beach where the canoes had been stored. They damaged and sank most of the canoes, but began their escape in another one. It was at this point, according to the legend, that Hannah stopped the escape in progress and did something that caused her to become a Puritan icon and has been debated heavily ever since. She went back to her slain captors and scalped them. Now, for anyone unfamiliar with scalping, let me explain the process.
It's not good.
No. This is something that you would do to an enemy to prove that you had killed this person. And it's literally removing the skin, basically the pate from the top of a person's head, hair and all. And you would take this back as proof that you had killed somebody. Now, I, growing up, had always heard this in reference to natives. Like that this was something that Indians would do to go back and prove to their chief and their tribesmen, like, look, I killed all these white men and here are their scalps.
Right.
But apparently it was not such a one-sided thing. And it's not just in the case of Hannah Duston, because the Massachusetts government, for a certain point, was offering bounties for native scalps. So I just found that very interesting when I was reading this story too, because I'd never even heard of it being used aside from natives using it. And here we have accounts stating very clearly that this was something that not only was known about, but endorsed by the government of Massachusetts at the time. Now, the point about the scalping is a little bit contended because the actual early accounts, they all mention that they were scalped. That definitely happened. But the point of like Hannah going back and doing it is something that's a little bit debated. It seems more likely that they did it in time. So they murdered the
Right.
people and then took their scalps and then went in the canoe and sailed away. Not that she went back. But I find the fact that that little tidbit was added very interesting, because it adds to the narrative that I think people want to be true of the case, and which I think makes her more of a folk hero, I guess, for lack of a better term, to the Puritans. It wasn't just that she killed these people and took the scalps either because she thought she was going to get money for them. She was going back for revenge, which would be understandable. I mean, if you saw someone bash your baby against a tree and they had taken you away from your family, I can understand you wanting revenge. You know, that's not crazy to me. But I do think it sounds more likely that she probably took the scalps not as a measure of revenge, but actually to get money.
Which she does get some.
She does. Yeah, we're going to get to that part too. Right now, actually. Hannah and Samuel and Mary made their way back to Massachusetts, sailing down the Merrimack River only by night and hiding during the day. Eventually, they did make it back to Haverhill. A few days later, Thomas Duston appears in Boston along with his wife, Samuel, and Mary, and they were there to apply for a reward from the government for killing native combatants, and offered the hatchet that Hannah had used, a rifle that they had taken from their captors, and the collected scalps as proof of the body count. There was a law in place earlier in history granting a monetary reward for native scalps, but it had already been repealed by the time that all this took place. However, the authorities of the state were so moved by Hannah's story that they paid her a total of £50. Actually, let me rephrase that. They paid the group a total of £50. Hannah, Samuel, and Mary. And Hannah received £25, while Samuel and Mary each received
half of £25.
£12.5. In modern terms, that means that Hannah got about $5,000, a little less than $5,000 for her troubles there, which is considerable, especially back in them days, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Now, the story becomes really famous at the time because of our old friend and enemy, Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather, as you might recall, he's the son of Increase Mather. They are both ministers in the Puritan faith, very important people in Massachusetts. They write a lot of books to keep themselves famous and popular. They liked to interject themselves into a lot of historical events that are happening at this place and kind of carve their own place in history. Cotton Mather really puts himself in the Salem witch trials, even though he was only actually there for a couple of days. But he writes a whole history about it, and and of course he kind of tries to backtrack from it later on when people are like, hey, that really wasn't a great thing. Because at first he was fully endorsing it. But anyway, we're not here to talk about the witch trials. Cotton Mather published Hannah's story 3 times in 5 years, including in a book called Humiliations Followed with Deliverance in 1697. Here's some Latin for you. Denicium Lucostosum in 1699. I'm saying these wrong, but you guys get the idea. He wrote these books. And the Magnilla Christi Americana in 1702. That was like the history of the basically a faith-based history of Massachusetts. And then he also wrote oh no, I'll forget that part. I can't say it. It's in Latin. Forget it. I forgot to look up what it means.
If he wanted us to say the names of his books, he would have written them in English.
And also, fuck Cotton Mather. Just in general. Okay, so after all these events, Hannah and Thomas went on to have another daughter together in 1698, and Hannah Duston is believed to have died in Haverhill in either 1737 or 1738. So she lived quite a while after all this. That would put her about in her 80s, late 70s or early 80s when she died. So that's a pretty good lifespan for a Puritan. But after Cotton Mather's death, after he'd been writing all these stories and everything, her story was kind of forgotten. And I think part of that is that she didn't write her own story down. It was she had stories written about her, but unlike Mary Rowlandson, there wasn't a first-person narrative account. She did, Cotton Mather does describe her time with the natives and everything, but it's probably not as exciting, aside from, of course, the spectacular way, and I don't mean spectacular like in the good sense necessarily, I just mean spectacular in the actual sense of the word, way that she escaped. But it picks up traction in the 1800s, starting in 1821 with the publication of her story in a book called Travels in New England and New York by Timothy Dwight. And after this, she is name dropped by writers such as Nathaniel Hawthorne, John Greenleaf Whittier, and one of my favorites, Henry David Thoreau. From then on, her story is included in just about every book about American history, as well as biographies and children's books and magazine articles, though these versions usually leave out the part about her killing 6 children. So Hannah's story probably became more popular during this time because this was during the western expansion of the United States, and skirmishes between Native Americans and the settlers trying to move into their lands were happening much more frequently. And perhaps this was seen as a story somewhat justifying the settlers.
The bad things.
Yeah, the settlers, moving in on the savages, and that these are savages. They're not really like people. They're more like wild animals, and they kind of need to be dealt with. They're not people to be like reasoned with. They need to be dealt with. If you leave them to their own devices, they'll come and take your women and children and murder them or sell them into slavery or whatever else they're going to do.
Right, and if you don't believe me, boy, have I got a book for you.
Right.
That's exactly the function that it serves.
Right. So as the story is told now, there are some details added that vary from the original primary sources. I already mentioned several of them, including the fact about the baby in the apple tree. Now there's a town in the apple tree, and now there's the apple tree in town, where people will be like, oh, it's this tree, this very tree where I used to eat apples from when I was a kid, and now it's the baby's tree, and this is Martha's tree. And to this day, if you I was watching some YouTube videos, and they were in this apple orchard, and they were saying like, oh yes, this is the orchard where, and it's like, well, that's not really how it happened, but okay. And also the fact that Hannah and co had already left, and she had made a special point of going back to get the scalps, as a mother's revenge, kind of thing, which I think adds a bit of juiciness to the narrative, that it wasn't just that she was trying to escape, and while she was trying to escape, very shrewdly, very Yankee of her, she said, oh, yes, let me grab some scalps and I'll get some money for him when we go back. It just sounds better if it's, out of a fit of passion about, a mother's revenge, that she went and did this, and she did it for the white man, basically, got these savages. And also added to the narrative was that she wasn't wearing shoes, or that she was only wearing one shoe when she was marched through the wilderness. None of these things are mentioned in the original sources. But at this point, now this is 100 to 200 years after all this goes down, some memorials start popping up to Hannah Duston. And in fact, she is the first woman in America to have memorials dedicated to her. And not just one or two, she actually has had 6 separate memorials dedicated to her. There was one that they started to build, and funding kind of fell through, and they ended up giving it away to somebody else. So it's in another town, and that's a whole separate story, not really worth going into. But the first successful monument was erected in 1874. This statue was erected on the island where she was held captive and where she made her escape from. The statue shows Hannah standing there, and it's a rather unremarkable statue until you look at her hands and notice... Well, I don't think you'd know what they were supposed to be unless you were familiar with the story, but the statue is holding the scalps.
That seems wrong.
Right? But otherwise, it just kind of looks like a statue of a lady. Like it's nothing remarkable. And unfortunately, there's been some damage done to it. I guess local kids go to the island and throw rocks at her statue. So she's missing her nose and part of her lips, and her toes are missing now. But this was big news on the day because huge crowds flocked to the island and speeches were presented all day long. And this was the first publicly funded statue in New Hampshire. And as I said, the statue is still there today in Busquan, New Hampshire. No idea if I'm saying that correctly. Sorry, New Hampshire, if I am not. I'm good with most Massachusetts names. New Hampshire. And I haven't been to that statue myself. I've only seen pictures online. But I have been to the second memorial, which was erected in 1879. I guess Haverhill saw that New Hampshire made a statue, and they said, hey, that's our girl. If anyone's going to have a statue of her, it's going to be us. And I think that they tried to outdo our neighbors to the north because this 1879 statue is a bronze statue. And if you look at the base, it kind of has these like relief inlets all around it. And it reminds me of the Stations of the Cross, if you're Catholic, where it has like a little picture and then a little text like explaining what the picture is showing. And it's basically her story from her husband leaving with the children and Hannah getting captured by the Indians. And then you go over and the Indians are marching her through the woods. And then you go around to the next side and she's escaping and scalping. And then she, and then on top of that is the statue of Hannah herself. This is, like I said, a bronze statue. And I got to be honest with you, although I do not necessarily fully support the statue's existence, it's a pretty badass statue. Have you seen it, Charles?
I think I saw a brief picture of it, but I have not fully seen it. Yeah.
She is holding the hatchet in one hand, and she is pointing with the other hand, and her face, this is what I would describe as mad dogging. She is looking very intense. And if you stand just right, you can definitely make it look like she is pointing at you and about to hatchet you to death when you take a picture with the statue. There are other monuments to her around town. None
is notable.
Yeah, I mean, that is something. But there is like a millstone placed. I think I might have the details wrong, but there's little markers placed, where her canoe touched down back in Haverhill and where the house used to be and the house where she died, which was a different house, her son's house. And, so there's little markers all around the place. And the house that her husband rebuilt after the original home had been burned down still stands, and you can visit that house. Now, the statue is now in a park called Graham Armory Park. And right across the way, they do have a gift shop. Might seem a little crazy, but of course, if you can make money off of it, there will be a gift shop about just about everything. And in that gift shop, as Charles mentioned earlier, and as I noted, they do sell a bobblehead of Hannah Duston holding her hatchet. I don't remember if it's bloody or not.
You said it was bloody when you mentioned it, which just added that extra layer of why.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. You can probably order one online. You can probably check, but
they keep the bloody ones like not in the store stock, but they have them there.
Special request. You got to wink 3 times and yeah. Well, that struck me because we were talking earlier about when I was on your show. And you asked if there was a line that I thought could be crossed in Salem. And the answer to that is yes. I do think there are lines, but I also feel like I'm not the person to tell you what the line is. And, I think to, quote Harper Lee, maybe you've go set a watchman, like you decide. It's up to you. Like no one can define your morals for you. So is this okay or is it not okay? And I feel like, in a way, it's not okay. In another way, I feel like, I should have bought her bobblehead And then I should have bought the Lizzie Borden bobblehead, and I would have the historic Hatchet Women of Massachusetts collection, you know? Which, if you're a spookaroo like me, then that's kind of is something that you want to have a little bit, like, even if you feel bad about it. But, like, you know, it's like, oh, wait, like, it's fucked up that these things exist. I should totally have them. You know, like, not like, it's not like I want them, like, in a way to celebrate these people, but just the fact that these fucking things exist is so bizarre to me that in a way you want a part of it. You know what I mean?
No, I totally do. And I mean, like, and this is I mean, this is something that's being sold today. And I think the line has clearly moved, but the line sort of still includes it. And personal taste may preclude you or me or any person from saying that crosses the line, but they're selling it. And obviously, I think we've come a long way from the late 1800s when they're building these monuments, and they basically look to this story as like the gospel of how how it should be done. And obviously, there's been a precipitous drop off in the notoriety of this story since then. It's not in the history books anymore. Because neither of us learned about it, no. And the monuments still stand, but you know, it's not a story that really gets talked about a lot. And I just this whole, as we've been talking, I normally I have a lot more time to form a complicated and possibly controversial argument like this because I script it and it takes me a few months, but I'm gonna say it and we'll see how it goes. There's a very Tarantino-esque vibe to this whole thing, which is the bloody, you know, all people, like, basically, yeah, Mexican standoff aspect of it that especially reminds me of how he handles revisionist history in films like Inglourious Basterds and Django Unchained, where basically they escalate to that same, you know, vengeful conclusion. But obviously, it's a matter of, like, most of us in the crowd are sort of rooting for that escalation against, you know, slave owners and against Nazis, while still finding it a little bit, you know, out there. We're like, but yeah, you know, I have fundamentally no problem with this. And I think there's an aspect to this that at that time in the 1890s or the 1870s, as they're pushing out west, they looked at this story the same way we might look at Django Unchained or Inglourious Basterds. And to be fair, like, that film also kind of does exist. Like, there's an aspect of this Hannah Duston story in the way that it might have been embraced in the 1870s that sort of reminds me of Birth of a Nation. And that's sort of like, we have to do this to them because they're going to do it to us. Right. You know, they're going to defile our purity. To which something like Django Unchained is not quite a direct response, but there have been quite a few direct responses to that film in recent years that sort of push it back in the other direction. And I think that's what's so complex about this story is it's difficult to obviously criticize Hannah Duston. That's not the point. You know, I think if you were to have an even-handed response to the story, you would say, no one did a particularly good job here.
Yeah.
Everyone was a little bit wrong, but we're all humans, and it was a war, and the circumstances suck. And what is, I won't say tasteless necessarily, but really makes you think is the way that we then celebrate that story later on. Like, what is there to celebrate there, really?
Yeah, well, that was kind of how I wanted to wrap up today, so I'm glad you kind of brought us there. But that was kind of going to be my question to you. Like, do you think that she is worth remembering and celebrating? And I feel like you kind of just answered that. And I would have to say the same thing. Like, you can't say that she was wrong necessarily. She did what she had to do. But does that make her a hero in the sense that we like to think of the word now? You know, like, yes, she did something that she had to do. And maybe that is commendable in a way. But does she need a statue, especially like a hatchet-wielding statue or a scalp-wielding statue, to celebrate that fact? And then if she does, whether she needs that or not, do we need to be selling bobbleheads?
Yeah, I mean, this gets us into the whole aspect of what do we do with memorials, which obviously has been roiling the South for a few years, which is it's not necessarily that if I'm saying don't have a Robert E. Lee statue here in the middle of this public park, that I'm saying erase Robert E. Lee from history. That should be in a museum. It is a part of history. Hannah Duston is a part of of history two times over. One time over in that in 1697 she was an important part of history. People were focused on her story. Cotton Mather recorded it, wrote books. That's all part of history, and that is a thing that's in a museum. But her more important contribution to history, and this is the thing about history, is we don't get to choose what history is. There is an important chapter of history where a lot of the country used this story as a way of conveying their feelings about things, united around it, made it a thing, built multiple memorials to it, more memorials than someone like John Smith got at the time, because I've been counting.
Yeah.
And so it's not that, it's just more so like in the episode that I did on Dunkirk, which came out right around the time after the Charlottesville attack, I kind of pivoted that quickly to be about the way that a figure like Marshal Philippe Pétain, who was the leader of Vichy France, like this is a guy who was a World War I hero. He was the savior of France in World War I, and in World War II, he is part of a group of people and ends up in the faction that essentially ends up conceding everything to the Nazis, while Charles de Gaulle ends up going over to England and essentially leading, the Free France movement. And as part of that, there was a time when he was, every street was, Rue de Pétain. And now even the last of those are gone. It's not something that's on the streets anymore. You won't find memorials to it. And that's sort of where the line is it's not so much like, is Hannah Duston not an important part of history? She is. It's like, but what do we do with a memorial in a public park of her? Why are we going to put that in a place where we all have to contend with it as this thing that, like, when we're eating a sandwich, I have to contend with it. A member of the Abenaki tribe has to contend with it. Anyone has to contend with it.
Yeah.
And it's not that I'm saying tear it down either. It's just like, that's the question to ask.
Right. Well, and not only these memorials, she also had a elementary school named after her.
Right.
That closed in the 80s, I believe. And to this day, if you Google search Hannah Duston, one of the things that will come up is the healthcare center named after her in Haverhill. So that one's really, I don't know. It seems weird to me to still be naming things after her in modern times.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. And like I said, we can make these decisions. They don't name things after Pétain in France anymore. We change our minds about things. There's a sense that, yes, we all have our own individual lines, and there's sort of a collective line, but that collective line moves. And sometimes it moves together, and sometimes it doesn't, in the case of a lot of the memorials now, where a lot of us feel like we've moved our lines, but other people haven't moved their lines. And that's always a tough thing to do. And that's, Hannah Duston, I think, represents a really interesting case of, like, where you don't look at her and fundamentally think what she did was necessarily an act of race violence. As much as, you can read that story, especially a version of the story that does not involve her, turning back and as, not in a fit of passion, but like as a cold, calculated move, going back and scalping them, as a response to trauma. And so there's certainly that, but, it's all so fraught. And it all is, that's the main, I've been in this era for a while. And, even there are these figures like Squanto, who I did an episode on, who are, we think of them as so squeaky clean.
Yeah.
And that has its own problems, you know. Squanto and Pocahontas as these, you know, just virtuous, good natives who are just here to essentially hand us the keys to their home. And the fact of the matter is, and I bring this up in that episode, you know, Squanto at one point basically tried to arrange a kind of a coup and turn Massasoit and the Pilgrims against each other. He got some of his family members to pretend that Massasoit was coming to attack, you know, which you're kind of, that really goes against this image we have of this kind of gentle corn planting teacher. And that's fine. That's better. Not necessarily for Squanto's legacy, but for an idea of basically it's an argument for not necessarily everything being black and white, as maybe the Pilgrims or the Puritans would have it, but gray, a lot more gray. Squanto is much more gray than we make him, and Hannah Duston is gray too.
So I think that's very interesting. I would like to wrap up this episode. I actually want to give Hannah Duston the final say here, because although she never wrote anything in her own lifetime, and in fact she probably was illiterate, they did find in 1909, they found a letter in the vault of the Center Congregational Church in Haverhill. And this letter is dated from May 17th, 1724. And it's signed by Hannah Duston. The letter was an attempt to make her a full church member in Haverhill's Puritan church at the time. Not really worth going into, but in the Puritan belief, you're not a full member of the church until you are essentially voted in by the ministers and members of the church. And being a member of the church was important because it was a good sign that you were one of the elect, one of the people who was going to actually get to go to heaven instead of just be obliterated at the end of your life, and sent into a, you know, great void of nothing, or even worse, sent to hell. In the letter, she does reference her time spent as a captive. Quote, "I am thankful for my captivity. 'Twas the comfortablest time I ever had. In my affliction, God made his word comfortable to me." So that is what she had to say about it, and I think that is a very Puritan thing to say. Like, again,
right.
Go ahead.
I think there was probably like a Wednesday night where she was just tucked up at home, like by a fire, where she was probably more comfortable in a literal sense, but I'll allow it. Sure, yeah. Hannah.
Well, I mean, she's trying to gain entrance to that church, and
right.
And so that's what she's saying. Like, hey, you know what? This experience brought me closer to God. It made me a stronger woman, stronger Puritan, stronger in my faith. And so it turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Because again, to her, this would have been a trial sent from God. So
yeah.
I guess that's the final word on Hannah Duston. And like you said, I could definitely see this as a Quentin Tarantino movie. He should have done that instead of Hateful Eight. Hateful Eight was okay, you know, it was fine.
Yeah, it's good. It is not as good as Django.
I love Django so much. And
Django's great.
Inglourious Basterds, but I saw Django in the theater, unlike Inglourious Basterds, so immediately pulled my brother by the ear to go see it. But anyway, all right. Well, Charles, thank you once again.
Yes, thank you for letting me come on and learn more about the Puritans. I mean, this was great. Thank you.
Well, it's very rare that I meet someone who's as interested in the 1600s as I am. So it's good to have someone to talk to
right.
about
Brothers in 1600.
Yeah. Someone that I can speak shorthand to, and you'll know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
All right, then. Well, I hope you guys, this was a little bit more of a historical episode than, you know, sometimes I talk about ghosts or video games. I'm all over the place with my subjects on this show. But I really appreciate everybody listening. And I want to point you to the website. That's spookyasshit.com or spookyas.com. They both take you to the same place. That is the show's blog page. From there, you can listen to each and every episode, even the ones no longer available on Apple Podcasts. And you can also find links to our social media. We are at spookyasshit on both Twitter and Instagram. And you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/spookyas. While you're there, if you really want to deep dive into conversation, but don't want your employers or family members or potential clients seeing all the nasty little subjects you like to discuss, you can join our private group, the Spookaroos. And once again, Charles, thanks for coming on and discussing Hannah Duston with me. And until next time, don't be afraid.